Hey everyone, in this video, I'll show you how to make a working loading bar. We'll go through everything from the design, rigging, animation, and then tie it all together at the end with the state machine. There's a link to the source file in the video description if you'd like to follow along. With that being said, let's hop into it. So unlike the other videos, we're actually going to start by creating a new file. So I'm on my profile page here, and to create a new file, I can either hit this button up here or right click on the screen here and hit the new file button. Now when I'm prompted, I'm just going to go ahead and create the standard size artboard, so 500 by 500. And here we go, we're ready to actually start creating our assets. Now I'm going to go ahead and rename the file and call it loading bar. And we can start by creating the background for our loading bar. Now, we're going to do that with a rectangle. So I've got the rectangle tool activated with the R key, and I'm just going to click and drag out a rectangle. Now, once I've got my rectangle, I'm going to use snapping to help me center the rectangle itself on the artboard. And now that we have it centered, we can go ahead and start customizing it a little bit. So the first thing we're going to do is round the corners. So I'm going to use this corner option here in the inspector and just crank that value up until I get nice rounded corners over here on the side. Now, if I go too far, you can see that we sort of get a little warping on the edge. So I like to take it right up to the warp and then pull it back just a little bit, and we should have nice rounded corners. Now, the reason that we're trying to get them this rounded is because in the animation, we're actually going to collapse this thing down into an ellipse, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So we've got our rectangle, we've got the corners rounded. Now let's add some fills and strokes here. So I'm going to change the fill from gray to black because it's going to be a background shape, and then add a stroke and increase the thickness just a little bit, and then select a color for this. So you can select whatever color you want. I'm going to go with a light blue here. Okay, so now we've got our background rectangle. Let me go ahead and rename this background. Now we need to create the actual fill portion for our loading bar so that we have something that shows the progress of how much is loaded. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this background shape and duplicate it, or copy and paste it. So Command C, Command V, or Control C, Control V if you're on Windows. And now you see we've got another shape here in the hierarchy. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this shape Fill and remove the stroke and change the fill from a solid to a linear fill. Now you can use a solid color if you want, but I want to use a linear gradient here. So I'm just going to set this up and keep the theme of the blue going. So I'm going to get a dark blue and then a light blue, just like so. Now you can see that our shape is a little too big because that background shape is supposed to contain this fill. So we actually need to shrink it down a little bit. So to start this process, we're going to use the scale. I'm going to hold shift so that we're constraining the scale and shrink it down until I'm happy with the gap between the fill and the top of the background. Now I'm not worried about the side just yet. I do like this gap. So now we can actually fix the width of the rectangle here. Now what we don't want to do is use the X scale to try and stretch that out, because you can see we've sort of matched the distance here and here, but on this corner, on all the corners rather, you can see that the gap there is not quite matching up, and that's because we've changed the scale so that affects our corner radius. So instead of using scale, what we're going to do is use the width property here in the inspector and just crank that up until we get the same gap from here to here all the way around. And I think we're pretty close there. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay, so we've got our fill set up. Now what we need to do is actually we need to create the mechanism that's going to allow us to control how much of this fill is showing. So what we're going to do for that is go ahead and copy and paste this fill shape, and I'm going to rename it Mask, and just go ahead and remove the fill. Now with the mask shape selected, I'm going to go ahead and create a group. So Command G, and you see we've got that shape contained within a group now. And instead of leaving the group style on group, because you see we can't see that group anymore, I'm going to change it to target. And now I have a nice selectable object on the stage that I can find fairly easily, and we'll use this to control how much of this fill is visible. So to set that up, let's go to the fill shape, hit the clipping option here, and when we're prompted to pick a clipping source, we'll just pick this new group. Let me actually rename this group mask. And we can now select that group that we created and go ahead and control how much of our fill is showing. And this is what we're going to use to animate later on. Okay, so we've got a lot of it created. We need to add in some bars that will animate moving across the fill to make the loading animation a little bit more interesting. So let's start by adding in some more rectangles. So I'm going to drag out a rectangle here. And I'm just making sure it extends past the fill. And once I've got that, I'm going to go into Edit Vertices mode. So I'm going to hit Enter twice. And then when I'm asked to convert it to a custom path, I will. And now I can actually edit some of these vertices. So I'm going to select the top two vertices here and just use the X property in the inspector to make a slanted rectangle. Now, what I'm trying to do is line this vertice up with this one. So maybe I need to go over just a little bit more. That probably looks about right. Now, once I've got my first rectangle looking how I want it, I'm just going to hit Done Editing there in the inspector. Then I'm going to select the path, not the shape, but the path layer, and copy and paste this. And now take that new rectangle path that we've created and drag it over until this bounding box lines up with the top right corner of that previous rectangle. Now I'm going to repeat this process over and over again until I've got enough of these rectangles to cover the entire loading bar. So maybe just a couple more. Almost there. Maybe one more. Ooh. Now, if you see the if you have this happen where the snapping actually pulls you past or won't let you quite get to where you need to go, if you just hold Command or Control on Windows, you can toggle that snapping off and get your object exactly where you need to go, and then you can let go of Command and the object itself. Okay, so I think we've got enough rectangles here. Now, the reason that we duplicated the paths is that we can select the rectangle shape now and move all of the paths at one time. In addition to that, we can control the fill of all these different paths here just using this one shape layer. So I've changed them all to white. I'm going to go to the blend mode and change it from normal to overlay. And now you can see we've got some nice gradient colors in here. So this adds some visual interest. Plus, when we animate it, it'll add a little bit more motion, which will make it look even nicer. All right, so let me rename this shape here bars. And as you can see, our bars are extending past. They're not contained within the artwork. So we need to actually fix that. So let's add clipping to our bars here. And I'm going to select the fill shape. And now you can see that they're contained within the fill. And when I move this mask, when the fill's not showing, those bars aren't showing either. So that's the majority of what we need. We need to create one more thing. We need to create a check mark, and we'll use this check mark later to create an animation that acknowledges that whatever this is tied to and it's finished loading, that check mark will animate in there so that you won't have any question whether or not the object is fully loaded or not. So to do that, I'm just going to activate the pen tool with the P key and create a check mark just like this. Remove the fill, add a stroke. Then we need to customize the color. So this time with this, I'm going to actually give it a pink color. And then change the end caps there to give it rounded end caps and rounded joins. So now it sort of matches the artwork. I'm going to fix this up just a little bit. I've gone into Edit Vertices mode so I can control these vertices here, and just trying to make that check mark look how I want it. Okay, so we've got the check mark. Now what we're going to do, Now what we're going to do is add a group to this check mark because we're going to change the scale of it, and instead of messing with the origin and trying to get it centered, I'm just going to create a group, and that should roughly center it on the check mark there. So I'll stick that in the center of the shape, rename this group, call it check, and then we are almost ready to go. The last thing we need to do is we actually need to turn on the trim path for the stroke, because we're actually going to allow this check mark to animate along the path, and trim path is going to allow us to do that. So I'm just going to go into the stroke options, come over here to trim path, and change this from none to either sequential or synced. It doesn't matter because we only have one path. So I'm going to put it on sequential, and when we animate, we're going to use this start value here to actually animate that stroke along the path. So we'll leave it at 0 for right now so that we can't see it for the other animations, and then we can just animate it when we need it. All right, the last thing we need to do is select everything on the stage, add another group, and call this group root. Now, this group we're going to use if we ever need to change the entire scale or position or opacity or anything like that of the entire composition. Even after we've animated or created animations, if we do that on the root group, then we won't have any issues with our keys. So this is ready to go into animate mode and get moving. So let's do that next. Okay, so here we are in animate mode, and before we start animating, I want to talk you through what we're going to do. So we need to create 2 animations so that we can control the fill of the loading bar, and then we'll hook those to the state machine, get that working, and then go back, add some additional animations to make the loading bar look even better. So let's start with our first animation here. I'm going to call this load start. And all we need to do is grab the mask group, drag it to the left until we don't see the fill anymore. So about right there. All right. That's it for the load start animation. Now let's add a new animation and call it load finish. And then let's just key the X position here of the mask group. And that's it. That's all we need to actually control the fill of our animation, or our loading bar. So let's add a state machine and get it hooked up. So I've got my state machine. Now, instead of dragging both of these animations onto the graph, what I'm going to do is right click on the graph, hit add state, select the state, and then change the state type from single animation to blend 1D. Now, what the 1D blend state is going to allow us to do is add multiple animations to this and then control which animation is playing based on a number input. So let's go ahead and get all this hooked up so we can see how it works. So I've added the transition, and now you can see on the state we've got this animations list. I'm just going to hit this plus button a couple times, and that's going to give us a space to put each one of our animations in. So let's do that. So I'm going to add the load start and then load finish animations here. And now you can see we've got numbers to the right side of each animation. Now this is how we define which animation is going to be playing fully at the particular value that's listed here. So right now, both of our animations would be playing fully if our number input was at 0. Instead of having that, let's go to the load end animation, plug in 100 there. So now when our input is at 0, it's playing the load start animation. And when it's at 100, it'll play the load end animation. Now, any value in between 0 and 100 will result in a blend of those two animations. So let's add our number input and test the state machine so that we can actually see this in action. So I'm going to add a number input, call this load %, and then add that input where the state is asking for one. So right up here at the top. Now, when we play our state machine, you can see our load % at 0. And as I increase that value, it's blending both of those animations together until we get to 100, where it's playing the load end animation fully. So that's how we're going to control our loading, or the loading of our bar. Now let's add in another animation to improve the motion here. So I'm going to pause the state machine, add in a new animation, and I'm going to call this animation bar idle. And now let's have those bars move across our loading bar fill here. So I'm going to grab the bars, key their initial X position at the beginning of the timeline, go to the end of the timeline and scoot those bars over to the left. And I'm going to try and align the left side of this bar with the left side of the fill. Now, if you're having trouble dragging your assets around the stage because of the snapping, just hold Command on Windows, or Command on Mac or Control on Windows, and it'll toggle that snap off for you while you're holding it down. So it just makes it a little bit easier to move stuff around. So once I've got my bars where I want them to be, let me change this animation type from one shot to loop and preview this. Make sure we don't have any hitching, which it doesn't look like we have. And now we can add this to the state machine. So I'm going to go back to the state machine, and instead of adding the bar idle to this graph here, what we're going to do is select the Layers tab and add in a new layer. Now, what this additional layer is going to allow us to do is play another animation at the same time as our blend state. So each layer can only play one state at a time. So if you want to play multiple states at the same time, just add in a new layer and add that animation onto the new layer. So let's add that bar animation onto our new layer that we created. Add a transition, and then let's go back and preview our loading bar. So as you can see, the bars are animating, and we've got this bar idle, which is filling up. And this would serve as a great loading bar, but let's add in an additional animation so that when we get to 100%, the user can actually tell that their asset or whatever they're downloading is finished. So I'm going to add a new animation, and let's call this one load. Let's finish. Now we already have a load finish animation. I'm going to rename this to load end instead of load finish. Okay, so what we're going to do for the load finish animation is have that background shape stretch and then squash down into an ellipse and have the check mark animate inside of it. So let's get started with that. I'm going to grab the background shape here first. Now, instead of animating with the scale, because you can see when I animate or change the scale, our corner radius gets a little messed up, and so it'd be almost impossible for us to create that ellipse. So instead of using scale, I'm going to use the width here. So I'm going to key the initial width, go forward to 10F on the timeline, stretch it out a little bit, and then go to 30F and collapse it down into an ellipse. But this mask is in the way, so let me turn that off. All right, now let's squash this down into an ellipse here. Just like so. I think that looks pretty good. Let's test it out. All right, now let's improve the motion with easing. So I'm going to give everything cubic. Let's test that out. It looks pretty good, but this second key, this motion right here is not happening fast enough. So I'm just going to remove the ease in, give it a really explosive curve there, and let's check that out. Okay, so now that the background is animated, let's get that check mark animating. So I'm going to go to 10F. So after our anticipation's done, I'm going to grab the check shape, not the check group, go into the stroke options, key the initial start value here, and then go to where the background's down to an ellipse and set that start value to 100%. So now that check is animated along the line, and we can take a look at that. All right, so it needs some easing. The other thing it needs is we can see that it's too big and it's not in the right position. So now I'm going to select the check group, scale it down a bit, and then reposition it. Make sure we're happy with the position. I think that looks good. All right, let's test that out. Okay, so now we can add some squash and stretch to the check mark and the background. So I'm going to start with the check mark here and go to 10F, grab the check mark group, key the initial scale, go forward to about 20, scale it up, go to 30, squash it down, oops. And then we'll go another 10F forward here to 40 and return it to its original scale. So I'm just going to copy that first scale key, paste it to the end. Go ahead and give everything cubic easing, and let's take a look at that. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now let's match that bounce with the background here. So I'm going to do the same thing. Go to the background, key the initial scale. And when it gets here to 30F, we'll scale it down. And then we can return it back to its original scale at 40. And once again, give everything here cubic easing. And let's take a look. Okay, that looks pretty good. If you want, you can keep tweaking your timing and easing curves and all that. But let's go ahead and get this plugged into the state machine. So I'm going to go back to the state machine, and I'm going to make sure I'm on the right layer. I want to be on layer 1 where the blend state is. And let's drag this load finish animation in here. Now we don't want this animation to play until we get to 100%. So I'm going to go into the transition, and let's set that up using a condition here. So I'm going to select load %, and now you can see we've got some options to configure this. So we can set it to be equal to 100, not equal to 100, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, less than or greater than. So we have a lot of different options here, but we're going to select greater than or equal to 100. Now you may want to set this to be equal to 100, but you'd have to talk to your engineer. For the sake of getting this working for us, I want this to play even if we've gone past 100. So this transition should fire off once we get past 100. So let's go back and preview this, and then we can change anything we need to, make any fixes. So I'm filling. Oh, we didn't actually animate the mask there, which is fine. We actually have that turned off, so we can go back and fix that. But you can see that the transition actually fires off. So let's look at that one more time. You see, once we get to 100, bang, this animation happens. Now let's go back and fix it really quick. It's really easy to do. So we're going to go to the load finish animation, go to the start. Let's turn the mask back on, and I'm going to grab the bars and fill here, key their initial opacity, and then when the bar stretches out, I'm going to key it their opacity at 0, so it should just fade over that time, and then play the rest of it. So let's take a look at that. Okay, that happens fairly quickly, and it looks pretty good. Let's once again preview the state machine and make sure it looks good. Okay, that's it. That's going to be it for this video. We've got a working loading bar. So if you participated, make sure you share this on the community. By the way, comments are live, so if you do actually share this, I'll drop by and leave you a comment. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, make sure that you leave the comment in the video, and we'll try to address those as quickly as possible. So yeah, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.